Okay, let's try a particularly difficult one today. Um, I feel like trying to make a bigger move, which is to say to do something which requires already having a couple of the other concepts in place. So today I will be importing um, concepts like the complicated and the complex. I believe that's episode 2. And to a lesser extent, some of the other concepts that you can find in my Medium posts. I'll try to keep that relatively light. But if you haven't really read and understood the concepts of the complicated and complex and the Cynefin model, you might want to do that first. So what I'll be talking about today is something that I refer to as the Tainter plus model. This is an extension or an effort to be an extension of the model that was put forward by Joseph Tainter. I should point out that Tainter has no idea what I'm doing here, and so this is not something that he has any particular endorsement of. So by ordinary deep code rules, if any of this sounds good or interesting, then you should assume that it's entirely his, and if any of it sounds bad or foolish, you should assume that it's entirely mine or ours. All right, so with that caveat, this idea requires a little bit of exposition, so it might take longer than usual. I hope you bear with me, but I do actually think it's one of the more interesting and incisive concepts that's out there. It begins with the observation of the fact that the way we humans so far in civilization typically get what we need from the complex natural world, which is to say the way that we access and make use of resources of complex nature, is that we innovate, construct, and manage complicated structures to do it. And we might say that the Tainter Plus model is an observation of how this dynamic seems to continually play out. I'm going to use a particular metaphor throughout the conversation, which is the oil system, the oil industry, the oil economy, et cetera, as an example of a complicated system, and oil in this case being a complex natural resource. So it begins with the discovery of a possibility, of an opportunity. You already have some kind of social environment that is more or less getting its needs met, and you come across some capability of accessing some useful resource that can add value to your social environment. And so it is discovered that oil can be used, say, for example, for energy. I'm going to simplify the example here. I know that petroleum has lots and lots of different uses, and I don't know the exact history perfectly. So let's just imagine that its origin story starts with energy. In the beginning, you don't really need it. Right? You've already got the energy sources that you need. Your society is not built around accessing and using oil. Just discovered the ability to do that. So it's all upside. And in fact, it's generally, almost by definition, relatively easy to get, because otherwise you wouldn't spend any time looking for it. It's not something that's currently deeply, deeply valuable. So let's say you can go out with a shovel to some field and dig up some sand, and through some relatively simple process, have yourself a barrel of oil, and then you can use it for lighting lamps or lubricating axles or whatnot. And the energy return is quite substantial compared to the energy investment. Let's say maybe you get 100 barrels of oil of useful value for the equivalent of 1 barrel of oil of energy expended, because there's just a lot of low-hanging fruit. This space of resource has not been yet meaningfully explored. And for some reason, you've entered into the possibility of getting there. And so it begins. What happens here is that because the resource shows up as not being useful, and in fact, because of the ratio between energy expenditure and energy returned, it shows up as being attractive. More people begin to spend more time getting it and using it. And as a consequence, it begins to add value to the social infrastructure. The possibilities become actualities, and it becomes useful and interesting to build more things on this foundation. You might, for example, begin to innovate things that require the use of oil. So you innovate the internal combustion engine. And this gives rise to airplanes and to shifting farm machinery to oil or to automotive industry in a fashion that simply wouldn't have existed before. And so on the one hand, what you see is an expansion of social capability on the basis of this new basin, this new reservoir of potential. On the other hand, what you begin to see also is that the low-hanging fruit get picked relatively quickly, and what you find is it becomes a little bit harder to access the underlying resource. So now instead of being able to just kind of dig it up with a shovel, you have to actually build some kind of structure. And maybe because it's being used more broadly, you also have to build ways of distributing it more broadly. And perhaps if the use cases are in fact more diverse, you have to actually start inserting processing mechanisms to pull out the distillates and to convert it into plastics and whatnot. And so what ends up happening is in order to take advantage of the increasing possibilities, in order to maintain an increasing demand, you have to increase your intensity of extraction of what is becoming a more challenging to extract, process, and distribute resource, which means you end up having to build a more complicated structure to do all this work. That's the major move. And there are a couple of consequences to this. One, which I think it's important to note up front, is that as far as I can tell, any interaction of the complicated and the complex will result in some externality to the complex, some waste product or some disruption to the homeostatic feedback loops that maintain the integrity of the complex system. So in this case, for example, at a minimum, you're going to be destroying the physical environment where you're extracting oil, at least in the narrow-bound area. Like the ground is no longer what it used to be. And of course, you see broader consequences. At the outside, the use of the resources, outputting carbon into the atmosphere. Throughout the distribution channel, you have opportunities for oil tankers spilling, et cetera. And I should mention, by the way, you also have different outputs in different layers. Remember the 4-layer model. You might, for example, find yourself in the odd circumstance that you're having to maintain a military structure to hold politically aligned regimes in locations that have access to this resource, which means that you're actually creating externalities into your social complex environment and not just in the physical complex environment. And we'll get to more of that later. So one is this output of externalities from complicated into complex in a fashion that begins to break down the homeostatic capacity of the complex environment. The second observation is that the complicated institutions that you're putting together have an increasing carrying cost, right? They're something, they're a real thing, and they have a lot of maintenance involved. You can imagine that you have to be able to build an entire manufacturing industry to create the underlying equipment, to create the underlying structures to extract the oil. You have to build a transportation industry to be able to move it from point A to point B. You have to train people to be able to operate this stuff. I mean, at a certain point in time, you're going to get a whole lot of carrying cost. So then we get to the next move. The ratio of energy return for energy expended goes through a curve. In the beginning, you'll see a situation where the ability to get better at doing it pays dividends. And so as you're becoming more complicated, you're actually also becoming more efficient. So maybe your ratio goes from 10 barrels of energy return from 1 barrel of energy expended to 100 to 1, because you've just kind of picked the low-hanging fruit in what you might call innovation space, not the low-hanging fruit in just finding the oil, but the low-hanging fruit in getting better at finding the oil. And this is the classic acceleration part of an innovation S-curve. And so this has, by the way, the consequence of making you want to double down, right? You're actually getting better and better and better. So keep doing it. And you extend up until you build out. But at a certain point, there's going to be a tipping point where the low-hanging fruit in innovation space themselves start to get harder to get. And so you're now spending more and more to get the same amount or even a declining amount of innovation, which is still showing up as an acceleration in the underlying return on physical oil. So maybe you used to spend $1 to get $10 of oil. Now you're spending $1 to get, this is very complicated. You're spending a barrel of oil to get innovation that, say, increases your rate of return on an energy investment in oil by 10%. And then in the next year, it only increases your rate of return in oil by 8%. So your acceleration is decelerating, but the velocity is still increasing. But now what's happening is you're getting into the middle of that S curve, which means that the top is coming. But at the same time, you're now stuck in this situation where your social infrastructure is now deeply committed to this underlying resource and into the proliferated, almost like the way that roots become increasingly more complicated as they expand out, the proliferating use cases and the entire social environment. So now you have not just a useful resource for transportation, you have an entire transportation sector, trucking and trains and automotive that has people using oil for tires and for lubrication, and a giant fraction of the entire unemployment base is built on top of the foundation of this resource and its production, its processing, its distribution, and its use. So what ends up happening is you find yourself in a situation where, on the one hand, this gigantic, complicated infrastructure which is now proliferated throughout the entire social field. You've got political influence, you've got academic and scientific, is becoming too big to fail. Yet on the other hand, precisely because it's becoming increasingly complicated and its carrying cost is becoming higher and higher and more fragile, it's actually becoming, fragile, brittle as a whole system. So we have now some kind of relationship between the growth of the underlying extractive and use capability and externalities from the complicated and the complex. You have an increasing difficulty in actually accessing, first, innovation, and then second, the actual underlying resource. So your energy investment to energy return ratio is beginning to slow down. You've got an increasing requirement or dependence of the overall social environment on this complicated institution, and you have an increasing complicatedness, carrying cost, and fragility, and by the way, difficulty in modifying this underlying institution. So like that last is important. The difficulty modifying means things like it's actually really not at all simple to migrate a vast oil infrastructure to some other kind of infrastructure. I mean, it seems like it might be trivial to move from, say, oil to solar electric. Even if you're doing it very deliberately, it's not. And obviously, there's lots of things that can't. You actually still need oil to do stuff that solar can't do. Okay. And by the way, all of this, and this is kind of the point, is so massively complicated that you're way outside of the conscious awareness of the collective intelligence that is driving and making decisions in the environment. So this is all stuff that's being done kind of in the unconscious intelligence that happens in just markets. It's outside of the scope of any truly comprehensive systems consciousness. It's happening almost instinctively at this point. So then you get to the last move. At some point somewhere, something breaks. Either the energy invested to energy return starts to vector towards flat, meaning you're putting a barrel of oil in and you're only getting a barrel of oil out. In fact, maybe you start getting less than a barrel of oil out and you're actually burning other resources to maintain this thing. And by the way, think about this in the context of the 4-layer model. It might be that you're burning cultural or social resources or geopolitical resources, or you're falsifying financial records to maintain the integrity of something over here that's happening in the energy space. These things can actually be transformed back and forth. It's really easy to lose track of what's going on when you make those transformations. If you're subsidizing energy through military, it may be difficult to connect the dots. In any event, the net energy expended begins to actually be more than energy return. And now you're you're screwed. At some point, this is going to come to an end. Or maybe the complex system begins to break down. You've been powering massive kinds of externalities from the complicated environment, the complex environment. Something might break, and again, this something might be something simple, like you just kind of reach the edge of the ability to reach the resource. Your innovation capacity just can't jump some gap, and you're no longer able to get it. You've hunted your prey animal to extinction, and just sort of no more prey animals. Or again, maybe it finds its way into some other domain that's not obvious to make the connection. Right? So climate change is sort of an obvious example here, but again, economics and politics are equally equivalent. Or the complicated system itself begins to have so much, it becomes rococo, becomes nearly impossible to stay ahead of the Red Queen's race, that you're running faster and faster and faster just to stay even, and your ability to spin plates just can't keep pace. Things are beginning to become so fragile that cascades and breakdowns bring the whole thing down. That's that. You find yourself in a situation where you cannot continue going down this path, and yet you have now become really rather deeply addicted to this path. And so any negative, any slowdown, even not even a going backwards, just a decrease in velocity, starts to show up as some kind of crisis. This is the last movement of the Tainter curve. So your innovation curve is now done this, but the Tainter curve is now about to do this, and you end up with some kind of involuntary collapse. In the Cynefin model, Snowden, you are now moving from the complicated environment into some kind of dive through chaos. And unfortunately, the further down the Tainter curve you got, the more rococo your complicated institutions, the more deeply connected this particular structure is to the rest of the social system, the more likely that you've waited too long, and therefore the more likely that your dive through chaos is going to be rather deep. Okay, and that's that. Some things to keep in mind. Obviously, I've mentioned innovation. And this model actually includes the way that innovation itself shows up, and the fact that innovation has its own decreasing returns in particular domains. What's interesting about this is that it actually is domain specific, that once you've created a bounded, complicated domain, and the complicated is by definition finite and bounded, while you may have a large amount of territory to explore, nonetheless, that territory is finite. And this is one of the primary reasons why you get decreasing returns to innovation. Right? You are not innovating in the total space of possible invention. You're innovating in the space of getting better at deploying this resource, in this case oil, which means you're going to have some innovation S-curve. And all of your novel innovations, anything new that you might explore, are actually going to show up as like choices that you can't make. They're going to show up as solar in 1973. They're going to show up as, maybe stopping engaging in energy consumption at this level for other reasons. Or they can see things that are in the sort of the possibility space of invention, but are not in the possibility space at using invention for the purposes of exploring this domain. So that's crucial. And all of this is now taking place in the context of this relationship between the complicated and the complex. And while it does very much seem to be the case that this Tainter Plus model describes something fundamental, which is that if you're playing the game of taking the complicated to act on and extract what you need from the complex, you're in a Tainter process. And by the way, you're also in the Snowden process. This does not necessarily mean that we humans are forever committed to writing this cycle of discover a new possibility, become addicted to it, and then collapse. What it means is that we may need to figure out how to do things that are more fluidly, fundamentally connected to the complex, which is to say, operate from the complex, do things in the complicated, but never find ourselves addicted to and committed to the complicated. That is part of the path of what do good choices look like? How do we figure this thing out that this model gives rise to? All right, I think that's plenty, and I hope that this landed.